Okay, this problem, we're going to go over it. It's a proportion problem, but what I really want to zero in on is at the end, those interpretations could get very complicated to understand, and I'll try to break it down as simply as I can. And let me just want to tell you that I personally think the most uh, complicated part of this entire course is interpretations in this chapter. Nothing to do with actual math, just interpretations. It's critical thinking. So let's just go through it. And I think you'll find after you watch this video that you have a much better understanding of how to pick the correct interpretation when you get to the end. Interpretations, in this case, there's like 4 of them. All right. We want to see if a DEM candidate is larger than 52%. According to our sample, 45 out of 75 preferred Dems, okay? Well, first of all, I don't even care what letter it is. If we're doing a mean, you check the mean box. If you're doing a proportion, check the proportion box. And T, Z, I don't care. So we're doing a proportion, okay? All right? So the null hypothesis is that it's the P, I always say P when we're in proportion, is equal to 0.52. And the alternative is because it said it's larger, okay, is going to be P is greater than 0.52. So let's enter the information in. Let's see, go back up here. So the level of significance is 0.10. The number of sample size is 45 out of 75, so 75. Number of yeses, 45. Population proportion. So the population and proportion is always, hey, what are they challenging? What was the initial word on the street, so to speak? The initial word on the street is that it's the proportion as voters is 52%. They think it's larger. Okay, so remember with the null and alternative hypothesis, it's always going back to the population proportion, population mean. Okay, 0.52. Never the sample mean or sample proportion in the null and alternative. Okay, all right. So the test statistic is a Z value, okay? It's 1.387 when you round correctly. And since it's a right tail test, this will tell you it's a right tail test, greater than. And that value is a 0.0828, yes, 0.0828, rounded. And the P value, 0.08, is less than 0.1, which is alpha, level of significance, same thing. And when the P is less than alpha, we reject. Okay, we reject the null hypothesis. Now remember, we are always either rejecting or fail to rejecting the null hypothesis, never the alternative, the null. So if we reject the null hypothesis that it's equal to 0.52, that basically means, in a nutshell, that we accept the fact that it's greater than 0.52. So I'm not going to read all of them, but I'll read you the correct version. Because we basically, you have to, and this is not easy. I will not claim for this part to be easy. No matter how long you've been doing it or how good you think you are, it's never easy, okay? But you'd have to read them. You have to read them carefully. And you have to basically pick the best option that describes that we're going to either, and or both, we're going to either reject that it's 52% or accept that it's larger than 52% or some combination of both. You just have to read them. I don't have a magic wand of what to tell you how to identify the correct answer. I really don't, because all the answers are going to be written differently. You just have to pick the best one, and based on the fact that in this case you're rejecting the null hypothesis. And that best answer is if the population proportion of voters before DEM candidates is 52%. Oh, no, sorry, I went to the wrong one. Back up. That's the next one. Okay, the data suggests, part G, the data suggests that the proportion is significantly larger than 52%. So there is sufficient evidence to conclude that the proportion of voters who prefer Dems candidate is larger than 52%. Okay, and that's basically because we rejected the null hypothesis and we basically accepted the alternative hypothesis that it's greater than 0.52. And feel free to pause and rewind this. I would probably, you probably would want to do that because I know I'm talking a little fast, but These videos will be long and boring if I repeat things, okay? And when I know you have the ability to pause, rewind, and take notes. So that's what I'm banking on, okay? Now, Part G is the only, let me repeat this, Part G, in this case, Part G, and I don't know, maybe different letters and different problems, of course, but this conclusion right here, based on rejecting or failing or rejecting a null hypothesis, is the only answer of interpretation that is dependent on whether we reject or fail to reject a null hypothesis, okay? All right, let me repeat that. That's the only one of the three, and they'll always be in this order. The first one will say, hey, what do I conclude based on rejecting the null hypothesis or failing to reject the null hypothesis? In this case, reject. This first question is always based on whether I rejected or failed to reject the null hypothesis. Now we get to these last two. Okay, and I'm going to repeat this. I'm going to say it and I'm going to repeat it. Parts H and parts I have nothing to do with whether I rejected or failed or rejected the null hypothesis, okay? Let me repeat. Part H and part I have absolutely nothing to do with whether I rejected or failed or rejected the null hypothesis. If you just plug in the numbers and get the p-value, you could go straight to H and I and get the problem right, okay? Nothing else matters except the p-value and the information given in the problem, okay? The only thing you need out of the spreadsheet to get H and I correctly is the p-value, which is case 0.0828, okay? It doesn't matter, and nothing else matters. The test statistic, the reject or fail to reject, nothing else matters, okay? So for part H, all right, it says interpret the p-value. But the p-value, again, is 0.0828, or as a percentage, 8.28%, okay? So I'm going to kind of break this down step by step. The correct answer will always start with, always, okay? If the population proportion of voters who preferred them is 52%. So in other words, it's going to say if the null is true, okay? They're not saying the null is true. That's why I said before, it does not matter whether you reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis, because the correct answer will always start with if we assume the null is true. Okay, in this case, if the null is true, that's if the population reporters preferred Dem candidate is 52%, okay? So you know right off the bat, forget this one. Start with if the population proportion, and this one's out too. If the sample proportion, you can forget that one. Actually, you don't even have to read anymore. Now I'm going to go through it, but there is an 8.28% chance, blah, get out of here, gone. There's an 8.28% chance, blah, get out of here, gone. If the sample proportion, blah, get out of here, gone. Every single correct answer for H will start with if the population proportion of Dems is true, whatever the null is, okay? So that's what it's always going to start with. So you could probably eliminate at least two answers every time. In this case, all three of them, but at least two answers every time by just knowing that it's going to start with that. And if another 75 voters, where did I get 75 voters? The 75 came from the sample size, okay? There would be an 8.28% chance, that's the p-value we arrived at, that more than 60%, okay, all right, there is one more thing we have to grab from the spreadsheet. The sample proportion, that's where the 60% came from. Okay, so I lied. So we have to use the sample proportion, which is 60%. Where did I get 60%? 45 divided by 75. Okay, so there are really two items that I have to refer to this spreadsheet, the p-value and the sample proportion right here. So there's an 8.28% chance, that's the sample proportion, that more than 60%, where do they get more than 60%? Because that's the alternative hypothesis, okay? Of the 75 voters surveyed prefer the Democrat candidate, okay? That's it. Again, nothing to do with rejecting or fail to rejecting the null hypothesis. Everything to do with if the population proportion, not sample, if the population proportion who prefer Dems is 52%, and if another 75 voters, it'll always be another 75, whatever the sample size voters is surveyed, the correct answer will always be the p-value, 8.2% chance. And in this case, it'll be if the alternative hypothesis were less than, this would say less than, but it says more than 60%. I got 60% from the sample proportion. So those two numbers came from here and here. That of the 75 voters, those other 75 voters prefer a Dem candidate, okay? All right, so let's move on to the last part, okay? Again, part I, nothing to do with whether there was, whether we rejected or failed to reject the null hypothesis, nothing to do, okay? And actually, we don't even need to refer to the spreadsheet at all on this one. Everything for part I. In other words, you could jump to part I and not do any part of the problem and get it right. Okay, you have to get this value and this value for part H from the spreadsheet. But part I, all you need is the information in the original in the original paragraph, which is right here. All you need is everything up here. Again, it's going to start the same way H did. If the population proportion who prefer Dems is 52%. So part H and I will always, the correct answer will always start with if the population, whatever the null hypothesis is, this case, Dem is 52%. And if another 75 voters, and again, are surveyed, then this 10% chance, where did that 10% chance come up? That is the alpha. Whatever alpha is, that's going to be the percentage right there. 10% chance that we would falsely, and concluding that proportion of voters is larger than, again, larger than meaning that's the alternative hypothesis, 52%. Again, that's the null hypothesis. So really, every piece of information you need for part I is in the original wording of the original problem. And you could basically read this and jump right to I and get it right. You don't have to do anything else if you wanted to just get part I right, okay? Again, it's going to start with, so now if you look at this, the population proportion, if the proportion, okay. All right, so basically you could get rid of this one and this one, because you don't start with if the proportion of voters, okay? No, I'm sorry, I was gonna say, okay, this is, I don't know why that was checked. It confused me, okay. Again, it's going to start with if the population proportion of voters who prefer Dem candidate is 52%, okay? Remember, it's always going to start with if the null is true, okay? That says if the null is true, basically in a nutshell. And if another 75 voters, okay? There would be a 10% chance, 10% coming from the alpha or level of significance, that would falsely concluding that the proportion of voters, that's always going to be kind of, tied into whatever the original statement is, who prefer Dem candidates is larger. Larger comes from the alternative hypothesis that it's greater than, and 52% comes from the null population proportion or null hypothesis proportion, which is 52%. Okay, that's how you get all those right.